Hello and welcome to another Evolution Simulator video. I'll explain the underlying mechanics of the simulation, but first I need to go over the changes from the previous videos. Unfortunately, I lost the old model that I was using to perform the simulation previously. However, because my programming skills have improved, I've managed to build a new model that's better in many ways. The biggest difference, and probably the reason you're watching this video, are that the graphics are far improved. Instead of using hexagons, I've used a square grid, which is just like easier and less clunky to program. There are also a ton of improvements that have been made under the hood that make it a lot easier to change the program and add new features. Interestingly, compared to previous versions of the simulations where I had to sort of manually nudge the individual trees in the system to have diversity by punishing them for being normal, in this system, as I'll explain later, I've actually managed to make them interesting without any explicit interaction. I've done this by slightly tweaking the nature of the features of the individual trees. So first I'm going to explain what the trees actually are for new viewers now and recap. Essentially, as you can see, the simulation is made up of lots of little boxes, which they're alive and they compete with each other to reproduce. I've decided to call these boxes trees, and you can think of them as analogous to sort of like a video game character with certain stat points, where they might have like an attack, like a certain attack value or a certain defense value or a health value. The trees have three distinct attributes through which they can spend their stat points. The first of which is HP, the second of which is vampirism, and the third of which is reproduction. I've given the trees a fixed amount of stat points so that by survival of the fittest, only the trees with the most effective distribution of their points will survive. The HP statistic determines how long the trees will live for. At the start, their HP value generates them a certain life value that decreases by 1 each round. The reproducibility value defines how likely it is that a tree will create a child in an empty square in any given turn. When a tree does create a child, the child will have some small random mutation. The existence of the mutation facilitates the process of evolution that we're trying to simulate here. And finally, we have vampirism, which is sort of like an attack value, except it also gives the vampire tree health when it steals health from other trees. The difference in this simulation compared to previous simulations is that vampirism is relative to the reproduction rate of the trees that it's stealing from. So trees that have very high reproduction rates are much more susceptible to vampires. So this sort of creates a predator-prey relationship where there's a trade-off between being able to reproduce and being vulnerable to vampires. As you can see in the simulation, trees are starting to die, which is because I made vampirism too powerful. So the trees were, rather than choosing to be good at reproducing, they're choosing to be good at stealing from each other, because if they're not good at stealing from each other, then they're just killed by vampires. So unfortunately, this means they're all going to die out, so I have to find a fix. In this new simulation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it so that vampires can only steal life from trees that have above a certain level of reproducibility. So in this case, it's a reproducibility of above 0.2, which means that if all the trees decide to be really conservative and, cover their ankles with high socks, they can escape the wrath of the vampires. And what this should lead to is some more interesting and diverse behavior, and that's the logic of the next simulation that's currently running. As you can see on the graph in the top right hand of the screen, the blob, which represents the genome of all the different trees, is slowly but surely moving upwards and to the left, which sort of represents how the trees are becoming less good at reproducing and more like vampires. And that's because all of the trees that currently exist have very high reproducibility, which, as we mentioned before, makes them very vulnerable to being killed by vampires. You can also see that the trees are becoming more red, which represents them becoming more vampiristic, which of course is why I chose the color red for that. It's also worth mentioning that as the trees become more like vampires, their average lifespan is decreasing, and you can see that because the average size of each individual tree is smaller than it was before. However, Once they reach that point, they sort of start to die off, because if they're not reproducing and they have short lives, they haven't got the ability to make more baby trees. So suddenly it becomes very advantageous for one tree to suddenly spec back into reproducibility again because there's space, and then they can take up the whole map. And that's what we're seeing now. We also see that in the reproduction graph, it's sort of gone down and to the left and expanded very rapidly, which corresponds to the rapid expansion of the trees that are sort of very small throughout the map. After observing the simulation for a while, this pattern seems almost cyclic, where a bunch of trees die off, and then once there's a lot of room, suddenly a bunch of trees with really high reproduction rates go in and take up all that space, because the space becomes much more valuable when there aren't that many competitors around. However, when trees are not deviating from the norm, they're sort of positioning themselves in a straight line. That line is pretty much where the penalty for reproduction stops. So all of the trees are choosing to have just the right amount of reproduction so that they're not vulnerable to vampires. However, by having that rate of reproduction repeatedly, they sort of get to a point where they can't sustain themselves, which creates an opportunity for the trees to evolve back into having a high reproduction rate. However, what we're seeing as a trend is that the vampire trees are slowly becoming less and less vampiristic, because when there are not that many reproductive trees around, there's no reason to be a vampire. So all the vampire trees are suddenly deciding to become conservative and have very long lives rather than have a useless vampire trait because there's no blood to feed on. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. If you have any feedback or want to see the code, please comment, and if there's enough demand, I'll actually go through and make it readable and upload it to the internet. Also, if you have any suggestions, I'd really appreciate those and would love any input at all. Cheers.